And I'm now going to hand over to our chair for this evening, Patrick Lorry.
Hello, that should be me. That should be me live now, should it? There'd be a lot of nodding and smiling going on, although not at me probably. Hello, everybody. My name's Patrick Lorry. I have been asked for the first time ever to chair a meeting. Yeah, we'll really have to pin our ears back on this one. I am speaking to you from Scotland. We are about to talk about predators and predator control in association with wader management. I'm speaking to you from Scotland, feeling a little bit like an outsider, given that this meeting will have a bit of a more of a UK focus. And I like to think that maybe I've been brought in because I'm a calmer, neutral, diplomatic voice. The reality is nothing could be further from the truth. I have some boiling opinions on this, but this evening is absolutely not about me at all. We're going to work through some of the introduce some of the panelists, and then we're going to have a conversation about predator control and how it relates to the conservation of wading birds. So a quick introduction to me, because obviously that's the most important thing. My name's Patrick. I was trained as a gamekeeper 15, 20 years ago. Then I went into farming, and I've been working on moorland management advisory, particularly for curlews, particularly with farmers and gamekeepers for quite a long time now. All the way across the UK, but latterly in Scotland. I've recently been part of the Working for Waders project in Scotland, which is kind of a Scottish equivalent of what the English Curlew recovery project's working on. So there's lots of stuff that I cross over with all the time in England, but actually there are some slightly different issues in Scotland, which maybe we'll be able to talk about as we go on. I thought that to start with, hold on, I get some notes. So the whole system's crumbling even as I'm setting it up. This is why I haven't been asked to chair a meeting before. It would be really useful at this stage just to go round our panel who we've got here this evening, maybe starting with Russ Wynne, just to sort of introduce ourselves one by one, give a bit of a take on our the work that we've been doing for Curlews, why we imagine we're here this evening, why we're part of the project, yeah, really kind of just make a start on all the different people who are maybe going to be represented here this evening. So Russ, can we go to you? You've got some slides to share. Fire away.
Okay, so let's see if we can get these going. So I'm going to click on open share tray, click on screen, bear with me, and go to slideshow. Right, can you see a load of logos and a couple of smiling faces? Good. Brilliant. Thumbs up, right. Yeah, my name's Russell Wynne. I'm manager of the Curlew Recovery Partnership in England. I'm based down in the New Forest on the south coast, and we do have some curlews. I'll talk about those in a minute. Just for those of you not familiar with the Curlew Recovery Partnership, we're a broad church of organisations. We've got 9 members of our steering group. You can see the logos there. The network that we have also has about 350, 400 members in it, representing a wide range of different practitioners and people interested in curlew conservation. First thing to say, I'm manager, Mary's chair. We've got this broad steering group. That steering group unanimously agree that targeted predator management, both lethal and non-lethal, should be part of the curlew conservation toolkit. So I just want to get that out there up front. Just in terms of some background, we've got about 60,000 breeding pairs of curlew in the UK. There's some error bars around that. Some of the data are quite old now. About half of those in England, about 30,000 pairs in England, but I think that's probably a max figure. It could well be a bit lower than that. But importantly, only about 500 pairs of those are south of the Pennine chain. So if you look at the map, if you look south of the Black Line in southern England and all of Wales and all of Ireland, across all of that area, there's possibly as few as 2,000 pairs of breeding curlew remaining. That's about half the range. So if you lose those, which is an imminent possibility in the next few decades, based on current trends, then we'll lose about half of the curlew breeding range in the UK and Ireland. We know from work done by the BTO and others, some of the science behind this, the adult survival is good, over 90% for adults, lower in first year birds, about a third of them survive, but once they get to adulthood, they do pretty well at winter. So it's not an issue really around winter survival, it's productivity, which is really poor. It's about 0.25 chicks per pair per year, at the moment in the UK. It needs to be probably double that for a stable and sustainable population. So just to quantify that in a different way, some nice work by Graham Appleton, who runs the Wader Tales blog. He worked out that we need 10,000 more chicks per year in the UK for a sustainable population, i.e. to break even. So that's a pretty staggering figure. And that indicates that we need national scale solutions. There's a lot of interesting things like head starting and other initiatives, but really it's going to be national scale things like agri-environment that are going to turn it around for Curlew, if at all. What are the threats? Land use change, so Curlew breeding habitat being buried beneath forestry, concrete, wintering grounds. There are nibbling away developments, sea level rise. But the big issues on productivity are farming operations, particularly associated with grass cutting for silage and hay, and predation. And that's predation of the eggs and the chicks during the breeding season. And that image bottom left is one that I took in the New Forest a couple
Russ,
of.
can I just bring in here? You're no longer sharing your screen, Russ.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. I thought yeah. Okay. Sorry. I assumed that we were.
Can any? Okay, let's try that again. Can you see it now, Mary?
No, I can't. Nope.
No.
I can't hear it. See it.
Okay. Let's go to screen share. Try that again.
It was there and then it disappeared.
Yeah, I think something.
Yeah, you're there now. Thank you.
Yeah, I see it. You can see it now.
All right. Well, anyway, bottom left. Well, the pictures of a bit of Irish landscape, a bit of coast, and a tractor collecting grass is self-evident. The one bottom left is a fox in daylight quartering through a Curlew breeding territory down here in the New Forest. So they're the threats. So what are we doing about it? Mary and I have gone around the country, as well as some of our steering group members, visiting as wide a range of people and habitats as we can. We've got working groups looking at various issues. We've got one spinning up this winter looking at gull predation in some of the upland areas. We've run field-based workshops, online workshops. This winter we're going to have one on predator management and one on nest cameras, and our colleagues at GWCT will hopefully take a leading role in that. In terms of policy, I think it's fair to say we've had good engagement with Natural England and with the Forestry Commission. We've met the chief executives of both organisations. We've had limited success in getting top-level engagement with DEFRA. We haven't managed to have ministerial engagement, and we've had a lot of trouble getting hold of the top players in the agri-environment team. So that has been a disappointment, but we recognise that DEFRA has got a lot on its plate at the minute, none more so than right now with the current review of agri-environment. Importantly, lethal predator control isn't currently funded in agri-environment schemes. And it was quite interesting. We had a meeting of people involved in the Farming in Protected Landscapes programme, which is an English programme funded by DEFRA. There's about half a dozen projects where Curlew conservation was a key component, and a couple of them had put in predator management as part of their proposal, and the FIPL board said we can't support that because DEFRA won't fund it. So there's a big question mark about will predator management be funded under the new environmental land management scheme. The early signs from ELM are not promising. The lower tier isn't doing much for Curlew. The upper tier isn't doing much for Curlew. A lot is going to be based around the mid-tier, and a lot is going to be based around whether that includes funding for things like predator management and compensation for farmers to leave grass cutting till later or not at all. We need to quantify wider benefits of predator control. It's not just about curlews. Predators exert pressure on other ground nesting birds and some other species as well. And we need to account for local variation. As Patrick will know, the work that Working for Waders have done in Scotland over the last couple of years with nest cameras shows that sometimes the predators are not the ones that we might have expected. And certainly in England, across the country, listening to different people, in some areas it's foxes, in other areas it's avian predators, in other areas it's lesser blackbacks, in other areas it's badgers. So there's not a one size fits all at a national scale. But the bottom line is, without predator control at some level, both non-lethal and lethal, Curlew decline will continue across much of the country. And for me as a scientist, it's a numbers game. You know, we can't argue with the numbers. The science has been done. We know what the problem is. And then ultimately, policymakers have to make a choice as to whether they're going to support it or not. If they don't, then I think we know what the end game is going to be. Just to finish up, I want to bring it back here to the New Forest as a bit of a case study. We've only got 40 pairs of curlew left in the New Forest, but that is just under 10% of the remaining lowland southern England population. So regionally, it's significant. That's dropped by about 2/3 in the last couple of decades, in line with national declines. And we know from the work that we've done over the last few years and work being done by GWCT, Forestry England, that it's productivity that's the blocker. So we're only fledging 5 to 10 chicks per year from that population of 40 breeding pairs. So we know over the last few years that we lose about half of the nests at the egg stage. A lot of those are at night, and the work being done by GWCT with nest cameras indicates that foxes are one of the significant contributors. But then for those that do make it to the chick stage, we lose 80 to 90% of those each year. And that's probably a mix of different avian predators. There's a picture there of a carrion crow on a grey squirrel roadkill. We don't have very large-scale pheasant releases, but we've got a very big urban and suburban human population. We've got the Southampton and Bournemouth conurbations on our doorstep. And whenever predator control has been carried out in the forest on things like foxes, they quickly backfill with more animals. So there is some targeted predator management being done at the minute. It's very difficult in the New Forest because it's open access land. It's one of the most visited national parks in the country. But there's a recognition that without it, we're not going to solve the problem. We don't have agricultural issues in the New Forest. It's not a farmed landscape on the main area where the curlews are. It's predation that is the limiting factor. And how we deal with that in the future is going to be really challenging, with quite a small team of local keepers trying to do their best. I'll finish. I've stopped sharing again for some reason, but I'll stop there. That was I think they're the main points that I wanted to get across. Thank you, Patrick.
Russell, that's fantastic, and what you've done there is kind of précis a huge amount of territory that I hope we'll be able to go into in more detail next. But I mean, even that specific case example covers loads of stuff that we've got Bill to talk about later in more detail. So if we go straight now to another panelist, Patrick Gilbraith. Patrick, why are you here? Why were you asked to take part in this panel? Who are you? Introduce yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I edit a magazine called Shooting Times magazine, Shooting Times and Country magazine, which is Britain's best-selling field sports magazine. So we've got a lot of readers who are very into conservation and very into curlew conservation, but we also have a lot of readers who are very into predator control. So we have conversations all the time in the magazine, like, how can predator control be more effective? Is what we're doing, making a difference? And I think we're starting to have more and more conversations about sort of whether shoots are, because shoots come in all different flavors, really, and you get shoots that are really part of the solution, and then you get shoots that are possibly contributing to some of the problems. Russ was talking about pheasants being put down, and where you have a lot of pheasants being put down and pheasants being shot and not picked, you have a sort of abundance of food for predators. So it's a pretty interesting thing, really. We've got people right there at the coalface, and Patrick, Laurie, we've had lots of interesting conversations about sort of recreational predator control, and how people doing that can be kind of pushed in a better direction. I also recently had a book out on Britain's disappearing birds and the people trying to save them, and that was talking to everybody from animal rights activists to gamekeepers, to poets and musicians, that was trying to understand why people really care about these birds and how their sort of sense of identity is informed by various birds that are disappearing.
Brilliant. That's a really good introduction to, actually, I know for a fact that there's a huge amount more. You've really touched the surface there of introducing yourself. Tim Robinson, let's go to you next. Let's have a quick why you're here.
Yeah, well, basically I'm an on-the-ground practitioner carrying out predator control. Probably initially trained as a gamekeeper, but now for 21 years I've been carrying out predator control on a contract basis to conservation organisations, purely for the protection of wading birds, curlew, snipe. Probably quite a rare rare beast in the terms that you have no affiliation with the game industry, but sort of doing the job as a gamekeeper purely for waders.
Brilliant. That's going to be a really useful perspective, I hope, as we go through some of the conversations we're going to have. And Ian Newton, who really shouldn't have to introduce himself in any company, but it's brilliant to have Ian Newton with us this evening. I see that you're muted there, Ian. I wonder if you would mind introducing yourself, and as Russ gave a bit of context and a bit of background to the project he's been working on, I wonder if you could give us a bit, not only introduce yourself, but give us a bit of context into predators, what predators are doing, and actually why this is becoming such a pressing issue, what the drivers are, and what this looks like from your perspective.
Thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes, okay, fine. Well, I've been an ecologist all my life. I worked for the Natural Environment Research Council, and much of my research, in fact, was on birds of prey. I had 30 years, for example, working on sparrowhawks. Sounds a long time, but I did other things as well. But Mary asked me to say a few words about predators and predation as they relate to curlews. I may not say anything that you don't know already, but one advantage of getting old, this is probably the only advantage really, is that you can remember how things used to be. And I also have, a lot of us have notebooks to check how things have changed. But one of the most obvious changes, I think, in my life in the countryside has been the current abundance of predators, especially foxes and badgers. When I was a boy in the 1950s, this was in rural Derbyshire, no one who lived in the countryside then would pass up the chance to kill a fox or a crow. And this was not just gamekeepers, but farmers, shepherds, poultry keepers, anyone with a shotgun or a terrier. They'd be out after foxes or badgers or crows, whatever it was. It was regarded as a public service. So obviously attitudes are very different today. And why do we have so many of these medium-sized predators in Britain? Well, obviously one answer is that we removed their natural predators many years ago, animals like wolves and lynx and so on. But there has, as I've just indicated, been a huge reduction in human persecution of foxes and other predators. And the third thing, of course, that other people have mentioned already, is that we have a huge new abundance of food, pheasants and pheasant carrion, other roadkills, food intended for livestock such as outdoor pigs, etc. We have lots of food in the cities, freely available on the streets or in dustbins. And I think cities and forestry plantations together, they offer major sanctuaries for foxes and other predators where they can breed undisturbed. And that was not the case 50 years ago or so ago. Well, for curlews, of course, the key mammalian predators are obviously foxes, and in some areas also badgers, occasionally stoats and martins. Obviously varies from region to region, as Russell has reminded us. But the use of nest cameras has confirmed this, but it's also added a few surprises to the list of unexpected mammalian predators, such as sheep, for example. Many cases now of sheep eating eggs of ground nesting birds. Now, the key avian predators are obviously crows and locally ravens. And then we also have a number of raptors that are likely to take young curlews, buzzards, red kites, marsh harriers in some areas, although raptors seem to have less of an impact than the corvids. But we have very limited information on this. If you look at the diets of these birds, waders seem to form a very tiny proportion of their food, but we need more studies there. Some of the predators I mentioned are still on the increase, as you know, notably badgers, ravens, and some of the raptors. Now, as Russell reminded us, curlews themselves have a very high annual survival. I think it averages around 90%. This is based on ring recoveries, but ringing has given us no evidence at all that this survival rate has declined in recent years, which points immediately to the main problem being, as Russell reminded us, reproduction. And in turn, primarily due to predation on the eggs and chicks, borne out, I think, by virtually everyone working on curlew at the moment, in which some whole populations produce no young year after year, or at least they produce some young, but not enough to offset the adult mortality. Again, as Russell reminded us, we think about 0.5 to 0.6 young per pair per year. Of course, agriculture is a problem, and particularly silage production, in which the frequent cutting of grass can, of course, destroy every nesting attempt in the field, not only of curlews, but also of any other ground nesting birds. But if we were able to stop growing silage, we'd still have in most of these areas the problem of predation. And the only places where I personally know that curlew are producing enough young to maintain their numbers are grouse moors and other areas that are managed by gamekeepers. There's also occasional nature reserves where the wardens themselves carry out predator control. But this seems an important lesson here. And the GWCT, as most of you will know, in their predation research, they found that curlews breed 3 times more successfully on moors with legal predator control, and that breeding numbers increase where predator control is implemented and decline where it's not. They record a decline of about 47% in the curlew population over a 10-year period. RSPB studies have also confirmed that curlew and other waders do better in areas with more gamekeepers. And at Langham Moor, where I worked for some years, curlew and other waders all decreased as predator control was stopped and increased again when predator control was reinstated. So there's no shortage of evidence, some of it experimental, that on open moorland or any open land, predator control is critically important for curlew and other ground nesting birds. But 2 main habitat problems, as I see it, one is the silage growing in the lowlands, which we've touched on, but the other, of course, is afforestation, which covers open land and removes habitat, but at the same time, it provides secure habitat for predators, but no food for them. And most of the predators, whatever the species that nest in forest plantations, seem to get almost all their food from the open surrounding land, whether that food is rabbits or grouse or waders or sheep carrion or whatever. And that's true for foxes, badgers, crows, goshawks, buzzards, kestrels, etc. Only sparrowhawks of the predators get a good part of their diet from inside the forest. The rest are outside. And the RSPB work, of course, showed us that a zone up to a mile or so outside the forest, waders typically produce few, if any, young, and their populations decline over periods of years. Another study they did over a 10-year period found that decline in wader populations, particularly curlew, was related to the amount of forest in the surrounding area. If there were gamekeepers there, they slowed the decline, again pointing to the importance of predator control, but nonetheless, curlews and others still decline with that amount of forest in the surrounding area. Now, some parts of the upland are so heavily forested now that waders have gone almost entirely from open areas. Galloway, as Patrick will know, is a very good example. Langham area in South Scotland is also so surrounded by forest that even with good gamekeeping, they couldn't produce enough grouse for driven shooting. And with a government policy to plant more forest, what really matters is where this new forest will go. Without careful planning for new forestry or more management of predators, it would not be possible, I think, for curlew and waders and other ground nesting birds to survive in the long term in Britain. So anyway, I won't say any more at this point. This probably sounded more like a rant than a few sensible comments, but I really do think we have quite a serious problem on our hands. Thank you.
Ian, thank you so much. That wasn't a rant at all. That was adding more meat to the bones that we're now going to start working at. So everything you've said there, I think, just builds on Russ's comments out from the beginning. So actually, one of the things that we need to drill into, I mean, we have an hour and a half to discuss this. We're already half an hour in. I'm keen just to fire straight into what we actually mean when we're talking about predator control. And actually what it looks like. And I wonder if Patrick Galbraith maybe would like to start us given your role as editor of Shooting Times, Patrick, you've done a lot of travelling, a lot of legwork.
Yeah.
How does it look in different parts of the country? Is there any single definition of predator control, or does it take all forms?
Well, I mean, it takes all forms, doesn't it? Really, sort of corvid control and fox control are probably the things that Shooting Times readers concern themselves with most. I was very interested when I was writing my book, traveling around the country, as you say, you encounter predator control in many different forms. So, I'm currently on the Isle of Lewis, and I drove up this morning past Aviemore, and the keepers there are very keen on using hounds to find where foxes are, and then terrier work is a very big part of what they do. So putting terriers to ground and bolting foxes, which is quite controversial. They wouldn't be snaring there because the patches of ground that they are working on are sort of too large to be able to check snares in the way that you must to comply with legislation. Whereas, in the south, you've got keepers on grey partridge shoots, for example, on grey partridge estates, who rely on snaring very heavily, particularly when crops get up, and using a rifle to shoot foxes is much harder. So I think what really interests me is that a lot of people will say, yes, predator control is necessary, but lots of people have a sort of limit of what they don't like. So, snaring for many people is their line. For some people, it's using terriers. So I think that's really interesting. There's a lot of different methods of predator control, and there are lots of different sort of answers in terms of what's acceptable and what's not.
Totally. I think there's some really interesting stuff in there, particularly since we used to do lots of gun packs and working with hounds in forestry here, but we now have so much forestry that the hounds are
they get lost. Yeah. Well, in the Galloway, yeah.
But equally, in my experience, when I started out as a keeper in 2002, 2003, we killed 99% of all our foxes with snares, but those snares were set in such a way that's now illegal. So we've had to diversify and change and do things differently.
I think also part of that is that you have often far fewer keepers on the estate than you used to have. So, they've had to adapt the predator control they're doing or use different methods that allow them to work at a much larger scale. So obviously, you've got to check traps every single day, and doing that, if you're one keeper on 10,000 acres, which you could be in Scotland, isn't really practical. So therefore the hounds can kind of do a bit of that work for you.
Totally, I agree. And so Tim, coming to you, you're not a gamekeeper officially, but you are doing predator control, as you said earlier, is kind of your bread and butter. What's your experience with it? What's your day-to-day in the springtime, this time of year? I mean, how does it look to you?
So, as I said, concentrating purely is targeted at waders. So my work, I start in January, go through to the end of June, mid-July, flexible depending on the season, depending on how early the season's got going, how things are fledging. So say from can be early as the end of June, mid-July, then I'm off the ground. I don't do any predator control at all for 6 months. Then I'll start again in January.
Do you feel that you're getting best impact then for doing 6 month on, 6 month off? I know certainly lots of people would insist that it's a 365-day-a-year job.
Well, so I've been doing it now for 21 years. We used to do it for 9 months of the year. I always found that the summer months, August, September, were quieter, purely because the habitat, a lot of grass still on the ground, so it's more difficult, and there were no waders there. So we used to start in October. Now, yes, since we've sort of stopped the sort of autumnal 3 months, inevitably we do for foxes, for example, we do fewer foxes, but I don't think it's actually had any detrimental on the wader birds. Starting in January, is sort of 2.5, 3 months before the curlew will come back. On my ground, I find that's ample time to sort of deal with the surplus, if you like, get on top of the numbers. And I aim that when we get to mid-March, that we're on top of the numbers, and then it's sort of, you know, a controlled keep.
You've just said something there that I hope we can come back to, Tim, because there's some really interesting stuff there. Russ, from your experience in the New Forest, what's the predator control situation there? What techniques are being used? Who approximately anonymously? What kind of person is doing this? What's the job title of the person who's doing this? I mean, what's your experience of predator control in the case study you gave earlier?
So, I mean, the New Forest is a bit of an anomaly because it's all on the Crown lands, which are managed by Forestry England. So it's all open access land. So we get 15 million day visitors a year, and they can roam anywhere across that area. So that means that interventions that are used elsewhere in southern England, like nest fencing to protect nests at the egg stage, we can't do that in the New Forest because of all the free roaming livestock and other factors. So the only tool available to the local team of Forestry England keepers is targeted nocturnal fox control and a little bit of larsen trapping. And it's only really in the last 12 months or so that they've started to talk about that publicly. Obviously, it's very sensitive locally amongst some sectors of the community. The other thing that's interesting is the work that GWCT are doing is, as well as the nest cameras, they're starting to look at stomach contents. Early indications are there's quite a lot of food remains in the stomachs of foxes that are being shot around the forest. Given the human population levels around here, that's perhaps not surprising. So we've just started to get a dialogue going in the local media about people feeding foxes in their back garden, often just a stone's throw away from where there might be breeding curlew, lapwing, snipe. And that's a really difficult conversation to have because they're not doing anything wrong by feeding foxes. They'll think they're doing a good thing, but we know that it's contributing to these elevated predator levels. So as well as the practical components of how you deliver the predator control on the ground, there's a societal element of how you bring people with you on that journey, in terms of them understanding that it's a choice of you either have curlews or you don't. And if you want curlews, you're going to have to deliver some predator control in this landscape, but also to make people realise that they can also help by not feeding foxes, badgers, etc. in their back gardens when they're very close to breeding waded territories. The other thing I'd say, Ian made a very good point about the changing predator landscape. So in the New Forest, we've now got about 25 pairs of raven. We've surveyed them in detail over the last couple of years. 2 decades ago, we didn't have breeding raven. 2 decades ago, we didn't have breeding goss, but they're not necessarily an issue with curlew. But we've got marsh harrier breeding at the coast, and they now come inland during the breeding season and are specialist at seizing waded chicks and taking them back to their nest sites on the nearby coast. So there's a whole cohort of protected species that can't be controlled that are now chipping away, particularly at the chick stage, which is adding yet more pressure. The final thing I say is that we are getting a run of very dry summers at the minute, and that means that the valley mires and the wetter areas where our breeding waders have retreated to in the forest are now more open to things like badgers to roam around in and access. And we've also put lots of access points because of the commoning and the recreation aspect in the forest. We've made it a lot easier for predators to move through the landscape. In what should be quite a wet landscape, it's now a lot easier for a fox or a badger to get into some of those wet areas where the predators are. So hopefully you can see a picture there. It's multifaceted, it's bloody complicated. And we don't have any easy answers to how we solve it, and we may not be able to solve it. We're going to give it a good go, but at the moment it feels like we're fighting the tide a little bit.
That's really interesting, Russell. And so they're well, we've got a really broad mix of people in this meeting here this evening. Some people will be absolutely right up on the money with everything you've just said, and others are maybe coming at this from a more general perspective. One thing that just really struck me when you said the word larsen traps, to me, I've been running larsen traps for 20 plus years. Larsen traps to me are a really important tool, but I know that lots of people really don't like larsen traps. So to be clear, larsen traps involve the use of a captive crow to catch other crows, or they can do that, or they can be used just with baits. The law in Scotland is slightly different from it is in England, but certainly there's a big opposition to larsen traps, and it's interesting then that almost represents a bit of a trade-off between the predator controller trying to do a quick, efficient, cost-effective job, there's no question that larceny traps are a really good way to catch crows, and you'll catch loads of crows in a larceny trap, which might take you months to shoot individually or catch in any other way. And so, as Patrick said earlier about people maybe not being happier with terrier work, or maybe not being happy with snares, a lot of the decisions made to use these predator control tools trade off how acceptable people think they are, how efficient they are, how expensive they are. And actually, when the predator controller is going out there to deliver the objective, there's a huge amount of kind of baggage and a huge amount of decisions that have already been made kind of in your head before you've even got to that stage. That's maybe something I'd like to ask Tim a little bit about, and go back to Tim a little bit, because Tim, on what sort of scale are you working? Because I think scale is a really important factor in a lot of issues to do with predator control. What kind of area of ground are you covering, and how does that fit with other people who are also doing predator control? Are you out on your own, or are you part of a group?
So permission for the land permission, I've got in excess of 5,000 acres. There's two of us that do it, as I say, for 6 months a year. There's two of us on it. Well, me full time, somebody else part time. So first 2 months, January, February, we were sort of doing the wide area. We're not covering the whole 5,000 acres. That's a rough approximation. But we are wider than the hotspot wader curlew breeding sites. Then as we come into, say, when the birds start to come back, which can be as early as February, and we'll then move in, then we're pretty much concentrating on the nesting sites. We're fortunate that through the land that are managed, we've got a central belt of in-by ground, which is mostly permanent pasture, hay meadow. Unfortunately, some silage fields which we don't have management control over. So as the season comes in, we'll move in and concentrate on that ground. We need to do for efficiency. At the end of the day, it all comes down to manpower. And the big danger is you spread yourself too thinly. And in my opinion, you're better looking at what you can manage, what you can deal with, and do a good job of that.
Sure, and certainly, as you and I discussed before the meeting started, I've done little bits and pieces of work in the Peak District before. That ability to focus attention in the Peak District is quite often something that simply doesn't apply across huge landscapes in the Scottish Highlands, where sort of gamekeepers will be covering 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 acres single-handedly all year round. Fine, they might have a much lower predator density, but logistically, it's a very different ball game. Ian, can we go to you? In terms of scale, your recollection of how predator control used to work, I'm trying to get a sense of whether or not of how logistically kind of viable it is to really focus in, as Tim has said just there, on a system that's working for him. And in a national context, how able are we to really focus in our modern predator control by comparison to your recollections of that kind of universal everybody will catch a fox when they get the chance?
Yes, that's a difficult one. I think, as I remember in the past, the gamekeepers that I knew in Derbyshire, they all had smaller areas to cover than a keeper would today. You're talking about maybe 1,000 acres or 2,000 acres, something like that. There were always a lot of keepers on the big estates, not just a couple or three as you might get today. So as well as other members of the public involved in predator control, you had gamekeepers at much higher densities than you have now. Some of them didn't have vehicles, of course, so they had to walk everywhere. And I'm not sure that was a bad thing, because they often turned up stuff that they wouldn't have done had they been in a vehicle. But that is a problem we have now. The gamekeepers we have are at such low density on the ground over many estates that you know, you wonder how on earth they manage to keep on top of what they have to do.
Absolutely. So that's you almost in a nutshell, Tim. Then is it that you're really focusing in on the most important bits because you simply couldn't cover the ground any other way?
Exactly that, and you know, the changes in legislation and trapping legislation, and over the last really over sort of the last 5 or 6 years, and codes of practice, that alone means that we can't do as much trapping line. So. Yeah.
I'm urgently trying not to be a participant in this and chair it, but I'd certainly say from a Scottish perspective, the amount of legislation that's been brought in around trapping and snaring and predator control more generally has stopped a lot of people doing it. And the feeling that I get, certainly from people who have no particular axe to grind, from farmers and land managers locally where I am in Dumfries and Galloway, is that predator control, we need it more than we've ever needed it, and yet it's becoming harder than it's ever been before. So that's probably mirrored in England, but yeah, certainly the case in Scotland.
I think, Patrick, can you hear me?
Yes.
One thing that I find really interesting talking to sort of amateur keepers and sort of farmers running farm shoots is that they don't want to trap because the legislation has become so complicated that they can't really, get to grips with it, and they worry that somebody will come across their grounds and find something that doesn't comply, exactly as it should, and then they'll be in sort of big trouble. And in an age where we can all take photos of things on our phones and things, that's a greater worry than it's ever been.
Totally, I quite agree, Patrick, and that was actually you preempted me. That was sort of where I was heading, but I think what we've done over the last sort of 10 minutes is look at some of the practical and logistical challenges around delivering predator control. But Russell, you were good. Well, you were good on everything in your piece at the start, but you were particularly good on the idea of policy around predator control and kind of some of the political context to some of this stuff. So if we look at the difficulty of actually delivering the nuts and bolts stuff on the ground, can you give us a sort of a sense of the environment where some of this legislation is going through, some of the pressures, and how this sort of fits in a national higher level picture?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think anyone involved in conservation in any form will understand it's a challenging time at the moment in the policy arena, given the government priorities. What I would say, I mean, Ian made some good points about the interplay between habitat and predators. We know that the two main blocks of productivity are loss of eggs and chicks to farming operations and predators, and the interplay between those two is really important. So if you've got a area where there's a lot of grassland for silage, intensive dairy, for instance, then what tends to happen is that all gets cut in a one-er, or when it gets cut, multiple times a year, it gets cut over big areas in very short time frames. So any nests or chicks that do manage to somehow evade the cutters are then left in a very exposed landscape that, again, a bit like the wider landscape, it tips the balance in favour of the predator. So certainly my own view, and I think many of my colleagues on the CRP would share it, is that under agri-environment, as it's going forward, whether that's the Welsh scheme, the English scheme, the Scottish scheme, they're all going through quite rapid evolution at the moment. You can plough a load of money into mitigating the issues around farming operations, but that's going to impinge upon productivity potentially, which is a challenge at the moment. But also there's a wider issue: is it best use of public money to fund a programme of curlew conservation that looks at interventions that don't include predator management in various forms? Because if you don't, and you know that from the science and the evidence that that's the major block on your productivity, are you then throwing money at a project where ultimately the outcome is going to be unsuccessful because you're not using all the tools available to you? So this is the kind of messaging that we are able to get across to Natural England. We've had good meetings with Tony Juniper. We've had good meetings with Sir William Worsley, Chief Executive Forestry Commission, and explained to him about the issues that Ian was outlining of woodland blocks and the way in which at the moment in England, at least, it's not strategic. So you end up ending up by default with this very patchy, heterogeneous landscape that again tips the balance in favour of predators over birds of open landscapes like curlew. But unfortunately, at the minute, we've not managed, even with Mary Star Quality as our chair, to get a significant engagement with DEFRA and to try and work out how the new agri-environment scheme in England is going to turn it around for Curlew. Because with that 10,000 chick figure across the UK as a whole in mind, about half of that's in England, so about 5,000 chicks needed. In my view, it's only going to be big scale national agri-environment that's going to turn it around. And we need to find ways of paying farmers, not just to mitigate grass cutting, but by paying farmers to mitigate the predation issue as well. And at the moment, we're not making much traction in that, to be honest. And that's a big source of frustration to me. We got the data, we got the evidence, we know what we need to do. It now needs the policy side to step up and deliver it. Otherwise, we're just going to keep seeing Curlew disappear from the landscape.
That's really interesting, because I think it really echoes the Scottish perspective, is that there seems to be politically a growing awareness of the importance of predator control, but still a system that doesn't really quite know how to support it. And certainly when you're doing habitat management for waders, if you do certain habitat management techniques, you can apply as a bolt-on. You can't be funded to do predator control unless you're also doing habitat management, but you can do habitat management without doing the predator control. So there's almost a recognition that these two things are related, but you can opt out of the. Here we are. There's a screen being shared here. I don't know whether that was me. Was that me? That might have been me. I take the blame for that. That was me. So that's kind of slight sense of discord is the product. I mean, somebody will come to some questions. The last 20 minutes of this session, I hope, are going to be questions. But somebody's said earlier on in the chat, actually, we've been having conversations like this for some time now. Why are we no further forward? And actually, my response to that would be, we are further forward. It's just this is a really difficult thing to implement and fund. Would you agree with that, Russ?
Yes, I'm getting distracted by some of the really good stuff in the chat. It's the joy of Teams, is that you got all these amazing comments and questions coming in and trying to listen as well. I mean, we're going to keep plugging away with DEFRA. I mean, someone's just put in a really good point, is if you did have an agri-environment, for instance, that delivered everything that you wanted, could you still get to the 10,000 chick population? And that's a challenge. If you've got an intensively keepered upland moor, and some of the keepering effort in some of the big upland moors is in, their big six-figure recurrent sums. We're not going to be able to deliver that scale in the lowlands. All we can hope for is that we can suppress the key predator population supported by an evidence base locally to a level that enables the productivity to get up to roughly where it needs to be. Otherwise, we continue to be sinks for these birds. So if you had the ideal agri-environment, could you still get to the 10,000 chicks that you need? I'm not sure, because there's other things like forestry that are really big issues at the minute. The tree planting targets we've got in England, and you'll know this in Galloway, Patrick, they're going to remove, whether we like it or not, some curlew territory. We hope that the highest density curlew territories are going to be protected from tree planting, but there's going to be a lot of other curlews that are not in the highest density areas that are still going to get removed. Is that 10% of the population? Is it 20% of the population? Who knows what's going to happen over the coming decades? So it's not just about predators and productivity. There are these other things that are now coming into play that are going to nibble away. So as I say, it feels like locally in the New Forest we're fighting the tide, and bloody hell, does it feel like we're fighting it nationally as well?
Brilliant. That's brilliant, and it's now making me think, oh God, we don't have enough time to cover all this evening. Patrick Gilbraith, we've talked a little bit about how agri-environments funding can support predator control. You've got a good kind of national overview of how predator control is supported as part of standard shoot operations by effectively at no support mechanism. What does that look like, and how useful is that? How useful is that model in a place where there are no shoots and there is no shooting interest?
I think it's really interesting with keepers being sort of, overworked, run ragged. You could put it in many different ways. I think now with a lot of commercial shooting, you have some single-handed keepers who are doing 2 or 3 days a week and just putting down a lot of birds, and they don't actually have the time to do predator control in the way that they did. So I think that's quite an interesting, a lot of people involved in shooting want to see more wild bird shooting, and where you have wild bird shooting, you need more predator control. So I think, that understanding how those two things dovetail is a really important thing to note. I mean, most of the land in the UK is shot over. A huge amount of it is, and I think that making shooting part of the solution and fighting for that is a really important thing. There was somebody who was talking to me the other day actually about the book that I had out in April, and they were saying that they were disappointed that I didn't challenge gamekeepers about the things that gamekeepers get up to, when I was writing the book, and they sort of expected, me to do that because they think that's an important thing to be doing. And I think, making shooting part of the answer is a really important thing to do. Rather than driving, I think talking to each other and understanding where these different interests are coming from is very important.
That's great, and to pass some of this on to Tim, certainly in Scotland, some of the predator control stuff at all levels, at all organisations, we go to gamekeepers when we want to learn about predator control, and actually I find it quite difficult to work with gamekeepers now because they're getting it right, and actually we need to work with the people who aren't getting it right. So that's from your perspective, Tim, you're in a particular WADA hotspot and you're funded by AN funding body, but that part of a long-term agreement to keep you in place and keep you doing that really valuable work. What's you've been there for a while and you're going to be there for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I'm self-employed. I work on contract. The 2-3 year contracts at a time. I'm fortunate. We've had interruptions over that period where there hasn't been funding available. So how for the remaining contracts at the moment, it's funded basically by the basic payment scheme and formerly higher level scheme, now countryside, the new CS scheme, but not because it's prescribed predator control. It's just the money is creamed off to pay towards me because they're not profit organisations I'm working for. They allow in their budget X amount of that payment we're going to get from DEFRA, the RPA, be put towards predator control. Interestingly, in some of the prescriptions for the schemes from Natural England, it does say predator control should be provided, but there's no funding for it.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's echoed everywhere, I think. One thing I wanted to ask, fine, predator control has in some ways got a bit of a bad reputation, and because it's linked to people breaking the law, people doing silly things, people getting people being up in court. How do we strike a balance between some of the logistical difficulties we talked about earlier in terms of actually getting the job done with limited manpower, limited day, limited funds? How do we improve the quality of the kind of predator control we're delivering in a situation where, and this is back to you, I'm afraid, Tim, if you weren't ears pinned back on this, the belt is tightening, it feels a little bit on predator control. How do we push up the quality of predator control without basically punishing the people who are already doing the good stuff?
Good question. Again, another reason for I don't run, said before, I don't run as many various traps as I used to, is the other thing. I'm very cautious about leaving things out on the ground 24/7. As Patrick said earlier, everybody's now carrying a camera. These things can be manipulated to make. I feel, for most of my time doing the work, I feel as though I'm, portrayed as being a bad person, and almost feel guilty for what I'm doing. That's a personal thing. Perhaps it's not how it's perceived, but I've had people in the past. It's cost me jobs, cost me, down to money in the end. So that does affect how I operate.
Totally, and on that basis, that sense of guilt, that sense of anxiety is something I know that stops a lot of people from engaging in predator control. If you've got plenty of other stuff on, it's just a headache. Why would you? Patrick Galbraith, you and I, as I said earlier, you and I talked about a lot of foxes getting shot almost on a recreational basis, and actually predator control as a sport in itself. That's something that we don't talk about very much in a conservation context. I think people will assume that if you see a fox and you've shot it, you've done some good, but actually it's not quite as simple as that.
No, I mean, I think that comes back to sort of, shoots, keeping a record of what they're shooting and, and when they're shooting it, rather than just, as you say, people who go out and shoot kind of, 4 or 5 foxes in a night and feel like they've done a wonderful thing. It's quite interesting, I think, what Ian was saying about, living in a time when people just went out and sort of, killed foxes willy-nilly because they thought they were sort of doing it for the greater good. And that's not where we are now. So it's making predator control count, and to make predator control count, you've really got to understand ecology. You've got to understand the birds on your ground, and you've got to sort of watch and really engage. And I think to some extent that maybe shooting has ceased to do that in the way that it did, and I feel anyway that sort of shooting as a collective is really recognizing that it needs to do things more sustainably, and that it needs to explain the ways in which it contributes to conservation, and it needs to contribute to conservation as much as it possibly can if it's going to have a bright future.
So this may have seemed, the last half hour may have seemed like a bit of a scattergun, but what I'm trying to do is open up lots of different avenues here, because certainly thinking about this event in advance, I was confident that actually this is quite a binary issue, and some people either like predator control or you don't like predator control. I think once you start to unpack a lot of this stuff, how do we do it, why is it difficult, what's actually involved, that's when we really start to get into the nitty-gritty of understanding what we're talking about and having a bit of a better conversation about it, possibly. But from your perspective, Ian, back in the day when foxes were being controlled very, very rigorously, it seems now that we have some evidence to suggest that shooting the odd fox every now and again actually brings zero benefit at all to wading birds. We're back, Ian, to some of the discussion we had earlier about really focusing in, sustaining, being much more clinical and being much cleverer with predator control. Would you agree that's a way forward?
Well, certainly, I don't think it's worth shooting the odd fox. Really, you've got to go for them hard in whatever area you're interested in. But also, in all the experiments that I've been involved with, the predator control experiments, we've had some independent way of assessing how successful we are at killing the predators. I mean, all you normally get on most estates is the number of predators killed, but you don't know how many were not killed. So as the killing has proceeded, we've had other ways like monitoring fresh droppings, scats on the ground, that sort of thing, to give us a measure of how successful the killing has been. So we know when it's been effective, when we've really reduced the numbers, rather than just harvesting them, and taking off a certain number, but leaving a lot behind. So that's quite an important thing, to have some independent measure of how successful you're being there.
So no, sorry, on you go.
Well, I've just got to move on to another topic concerning predator control. If you want to stay on this one or move a little bit.
No, do move. So we're approaching the start of sort of question time. One thing I've been really conscious of is that we haven't gone, and I've deliberately tried not to go anywhere near the should we, shouldn't we. I'm trying to have the let's talk of a broader discussion about predator control. So yes, by all means, means.
It's really a question. This is that do foxes travel easily over wet ground as opposed to dry ground? I've often heard from keepers and other people that if the ground is wet or partly flooded, as ground often used to be, rushy fields and so on, they're much more reluctant to walk through water than they are over dry land, and that the sheer drainage of farmland and grassland would have made it much more accessible to foxes who are more prepared to cross it under those circumstances. And I don't know whether that's true. I just wonder if anyone else had that experience, because that's one factor. The drainage of agricultural land over the last several decades, that's one factor that could have increased the effects of of foxes on their prey species. But I mean, I don't know the answer to it.
Tim, have you got a take on that?
Yeah, from my experience, I mean, you know, most of the ground I work on is very wet ground. It's getting wetter. You know, we're doing the habitat work, blocking ditches, you know, to wet it up. You know, I mean, this is something that's come in sort of in the last 10 years when thermal imaging and night vision has become sort of an affordable thing, and you can observe, you know, all predators doing what they do, you know, uninterrupted, and certainly foxes on my ground follow regular routes, and they are following the old walls or banks, you know, ditch embankments. They do not like crossing wet fields, and you very, very, very rarely shoot a dirty fox. If you shoot a dirty fox or a muddy fox, it's generally ailing from something else. It's put in ticks, you know, it's mange or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, Ian, I think that's probably a valid.
Well, it's one thing that's changed enormously since the 1970s, for example. Much of British farmland has been redrained since that time. So we've given them a much better landscape in which they can operate than they would have had before that.
There's a fine line though there, Ian, because if I was going to look for a fox on my place, I would look for a nice, well, gradually sloping, rushy field, particularly on a windy day with a nice bright sun. That would be exactly where you'd find him. So,
right. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question, Patrick, as well?
I'm the chairman, Patrick. I'm not sure.
I'm just interested in how predator control can sort of have better PR and be more palatable. You know, I think there's a bit of a feeling in the shooting community anyway that organisations like the RSPB carry out predator control, but they don't really like talking about it because they think that their members are sort of, you know, dead against it. I mean, maybe that's one for Ian. Do you think that is the case? And do the RSPB have a role to play in saying, actually, this is what we do and this is why we need to do it?
Yes, well, when I was involved with the RSPB some years ago, we did quite a lot of predator control on many reserves. A lot of it wasn't effective because a lot of the wardens are really not ideologically suited to that sort of work. They don't like doing it, but those that do were pretty effective, and you could see the difference in wader and other bird populations. I don't think the RSPB has hidden this. They've written a document about it a few years ago on predator control generally and their use of predator control. It tends to be a selected number of species, of course, foxes, gulls, and various other things. But they make it clear to the readership that they're doing it because they want a particular species, and they can't have that species while ever the predator's there. They've got to do something about it. And I don't think there's been a big backlash, at least in my time there. There's no big backlash from the membership saying they shouldn't do this. It was carefully explained.
I think that's exactly right, Ian. And I would go to you, Russ, given that a fair part of your remit is education and talking people through, explaining what's on. I mean, that's what sort of reception do you find when you're talking about predator control?
I mean, it's been interesting looking at some of the responses in the chat here tonight. I think generally we're talking to communities that are already passionate about preserving their curlews. So that's the communities that Mary and I have typically visited, whether that's in the lowlands of England, the uplands of England. We even ventured over the border once, didn't we, Patrick? So generally we're talking to communities that are very passionate about their curlews, very passionate about their breeding waders, and they already get it. I think, you know, the anecdote I provided here in the New Forest where you've got homeowners feeding foxes, you know, it's more where people, it won't even occur to them that that activity will have a knock-on effect. Yeah, or the person that chucks the remains of their McDonald's out the car window as they're driving down the A31. Yeah, again, it's not necessarily about preaching to the converted who are already involved in curlew conservation to varying degrees. It's more about the wider public, that conversation, and I think that's where, you know, people like Mary are really useful. That ability to reach out to a wider cohort of the population than you know, maybe someone like me as a scientist can do. that's where we need to start going with this conversation. Events like this evening are a stepping stone towards it, starting to get articles in the popular media. And so it's really interesting that Forestry England in the New Forest, it's just the last year or so with the work they're doing with GWCT, are starting to publicly now talk about the fact they do lethal control on the New Forest on open access land. And I haven't seen, and I'm very in touch with the New Forest community, I haven't seen really any significant kickback from that, because people have understood the context in which it's in. And ultimately, it's you need to empower people to then make that choice in their own minds. And I've presented some of the facts tonight, and it comes down to the numbers again. It's either you want curlews in an area, and all the science tells us what we need to do to retain them in that area, or you don't. And if you don't want to do some of the nasty things like the predator control that might be unpalatable to some people, that's fine, but you've got to accept that you're breeding curlews, you're breeding lapwings. In the current landscape that we've got, this anthropogenically created landscape, you're not going to keep them. And ultimately, people each have to square up that. But all we can do is give them all the data, the information, the facts in as clear and as sensible and an open-handed way as we can. And that's what the CRP is trying to do.
Perfect. We've had, so that, you're quite right, Russell. There's hundreds of questions coming in, but I get a sense, slightly condensing some of them together, I get a sense that a lot of the people, or some of the people who are involved in the chat, are drawing some pretty clear links between gamekeeping and predator control, and thereby being able to, maybe if they're not keen on shooting, or if they're basically linking conversations about predator control for curlews with conservation about predator control for waders. Technically, the business end of that doesn't look very different, but ideologically that's quite different. Tim, further on the idea
can I make a
of
comment, please. I think this discussion's totally missed the point. I mean, Russell's talked about the need to go and talk to individuals in the New Forest about putting food out for foxes. And we haven't addressed at all the 60 million game birds that are put out each year that are food for foxes and all the other predators that are doing in all our curlews.
Which I have to say is the next question that I've got listed to ask this evening. So we will certainly be coming to that just shortly, Mr. Smith.
But I think there's
I did raise it at the start as well.
There's a wonderful graph on the GWCT website that reports the number of foxes that are killed by gamekeepers every year, and it's gone up fourfold in the time that pheasant release and game bird release has gone up by more than tenfold. And what it shows, it's all the foxes that gamekeepers have killed, and what it shows is however many foxes you kill in 1 year, there are more the next year. So the way to actually reduce the predator populations is not to actually try and deal with them individually by culling them. It's actually to reduce their food supply at the landscape scale. And unless we do that, we're wasting our time.
I really am not sure that the data we've got is as hard and fast as that. I think it's a really interesting study, issue that we need to find out more about. But well, certainly
we've been doing radio tracking of curlew chicks in Shropshire for the last 5 years, and very few of them survive. Most of them get eaten within 10 days of hatching.
Certainly, and I don't think anybody's questioning the high mortality, but also I think we established at the start of the conversation that there are different issues in every part of the country, and everywhere is going to be looking quite different. But now I think you've thrust that into our midst. Patrick, from your perspective, how responsible is the game industry in effectively managing a problem that it's created? I'm not saying necessarily that's the case, but certainly there are lots of people who would argue that.
Well, I think, this would be deeply unpopular with some Shooting Times readers, but I'm very happy to say it anyway. I think far too many birds do go down. The increase in the number of birds going down is extraordinary. I was watching the other day a program called Jack's Game, in which Jack Charlton would go around the country engaging in different field sports, from ferreting to fishing. And so this was early 80s, I think. And he says that there are 10 million pheasants shot in the UK each year. He says 5 million of those are reared and 5 million are wild. And going from then to the number that get put down now is really quite extraordinary. And I don't think we fully understand the impact that that has, but it's pretty common sense that if you have many more birds going down, predators are going to be doing a lot better than they did previously. I also worry slightly about birds not being picked on shoots. So, I think sometimes picking up teams aren't as big as they should be and as effective as they should be. But I think, the shooting industry, has to really sort of be honest about it and sort of look at itself in the mirror and say, is this a big problem, and how big a problem is it? I'd like shooting to move in a direction where people are paying for sort of really good quality days in the experience, rather than saying, I'd like a 300 bird day, and it's a numbers game, rather than engaging with sort of wild places and the things that live there.
Totally. Yeah, I know. I think that's an interesting conversation, and it's an angle in itself. It's just interesting looking at the way stakeholders have traditionally interacted with one another. It has been sometimes frustrating to see aspects of shooting kind of weaponized and brought into a different curlew arena, so we end up having the same arguments we have about shooting, but we just have them about curlews, when actually there are some different subtleties in there. Again, from your back to this issue, I mean, this would be another thing about education that's come up. Hugh Rose there said in the comments, educate the public, it will make a difference. Tim, presumably that's you down the nose, that's your bread and butter, that's one of the main things you're doing.
Yes, but
yes, but
I'm very reluctant to put my head above the parapet, because I know firsthand what can happen if people take against you. From me and people who work for me, I've got a duty of care to them. And in the past we've had to pull off work because it was just untenable, really, that we couldn't carry on. So that's a double-edged thing. It also it can affect affect me or whoever's working for me as a person, anxiety, etc. Sort of don't want to lay it on, but also you have to pull off an area, and you can't do the work, and then there's the curlew there. The work's not going to happen. So I am guilty of not. If anyone one-to-one, if anyone, I'll explain all day long to somebody about it, but putting myself out there, educate, I must admit I'm not very good at it, as Mary will will agree with, I'm sure.
Brilliant. And again, Patrick, on shoot days, I know a lot of gamekeepers who do a lot of good education stuff, but how difficult is it from your perspective as editor of Shooting Times to basically avoid preaching to the choir and saying a lot of good stuff about what shooting can do to a lot of shooting people, and not actually really hitting audiences who maybe don't understand some of this?
Yeah, no, I think that is I mean, the sort of the education point is a really difficult one. I mean, there's a big thing at the moment about whether gamekeepers should have a name change, and I think that came up actually in the comments, whether we should call them, conservation officers or countryside wardens or whatever. It's really interesting, and it's really interesting asking gamekeepers whether they want to do that or not. And there's a bit of a split there, because some of them actually feel that if they did call themselves something else, or if they were called something else, then it would sort of make their life a little bit easier, because the very term gamekeeper has become slightly toxic. But at the same time, I think that that's just sort of slightly muddying the waters, and it's explaining the role that the gamekeeper can play, and explaining shooting's role in conservation that we need to be doing more of. But it's it's hard. It's very hard. I think sometimes it's easy when you are involved in things that lots of people don't like, just to actually not say anything at all. And I think maybe shooting should be better at sort of talking about itself.
Awesome. Looking at the questions, we've had loads of really good questions, but they have all fallen into certain groups, and some of them have then been answered within the chat itself. I'm not going to say there's been some arguments, but let's call it some happy bickering going on in the chat. Russ, how do we, or can we, smooth the road on this? How do we kind of develop a bit of a consensus on this, or do you think we're going to have to get to a stage where we simply free up the people who are going to do it, and the people who don't want to do it can prevent it from happening in certain places? Or I mean, is there, even off the top of your head, even is there any kind of middle ground here? How do we take the heat out of this?
Yeah, so we're looking at trying to be focused on potential solutions and trying to keep positive. And you know, Mary and I's job as chair and manager of the Curlew Recovery Partnership is to try and be fiercely objective through what is quite a subjective field. Yeah, Leo's made a really good point about release of non-native game birds. But we know that there are curlew declines in areas of the country where that's not an issue, and there are other issues. So it's a bit like playing whack-a-mole. But I'm not saying that isn't something that you know, ultimately it becomes a policy decision, and in England it's DEFRA that are responsible for implementing those policy decisions, and they're the ones that should be commissioning the evidence to then inform those decisions. What I would say is there are things where, yeah, you could crystal ball what's going to happen over the next 2, 3, 4 decades. And as things stand at the moment, we can see curlews retreating back to the uplands from where they came in the middle part of the last century in England. That's the default based on current trends. We don't want that to happen, and we'll fight it as much as we can, but that's the default. So then the retreat goes into areas where you've got managed grouse moors. Again, we don't know what they're going to look like in coming decades. And also the surrounding farmland, the sort of in-by and moorland fringe type habitats, that will become the areas that curlews retreat to. So then you say, well, how do you fund the conservation interventions in those areas in a way that is acceptable to the wider public, is good use of public funds, and delivers the conservation outcomes which you want, which is to maintain biodiversity? You know, it's not just about curlews. There's lots of other flora and fauna and fungi of open landscapes that are going to rely on these interventions to prevail in this country. So one of the things we're thinking about is just taking a very tangible example in the current agri-environment scheme. It may be that DEFRA continues to say we are not going to fund lethal control because of various pressures being put upon them. You know, ministers have to take into account all these different things when they make decisions. You know, could a compromise be that where sporting estates are involved in agri-environment schemes, DEFRA are talking a lot about blending public and private finance. So could the predator control that's delivered to meet the objectives of the sporting estate be used as a matched funding contribution to a project that also delivers habitat improvement and other interventions that generate good conservation outcomes for curlew and other things? So that way you're recognising the contribution of the estate, you're recognising the conservation outcome that's a shared outcome, but you're matching it with public money to also bolster the outcome in terms of conservation. So they're the kinds of things that we'd love to talk about with DEFRA. We just need to get someone in DEFRA to open the door at a senior level so we can start having those conversations. But that's sort of where our head is at the minute. We're not trying to be judgmental. We're trying to come up with solutions in the current political and economic landscape that will help keep curlews going for as long as we possibly can. Because at the moment, if we do nothing, we're going to see them removed from big areas of the countryside in the next couple of decades.
Yeah, okay. One of the questions has just come through. We've had so much to chew on and not really done justice to much over the last hour and a half. We really just skimmed and opened a lot of boxes and had to move on to other boxes. But we haven't really looked at predators which are currently protected. There's just been a good question come in about predators which are currently protected. Particularly from my perspective here in De Vries and Galloway, we have a tremendous number of badgers which we didn't have 10 years ago. We've got nest camera footage to suggest that they're taking badger nests probably more than fox nests. I wonder whether the panel had any views on, or whether it comes back to how much we really do want, how far we're really willing to take predator control in order to protect curlews. I wonder, Ian, from your perspective, whether you just touch the idea of where we are, the predators we can control and the predators we can't control.
I think in terms of bringing the general public on side, it would make sense to start with the ones that we can legally control, obviously. Having spent most of my life trying to protect birds of prey or devise conservation for them in various ways, I find it very difficult to make some of these predators, to remove the legal protection from them so they can be shot. But I have to face the fact that some of them are now widespread over the country. Birds like buzzards, for example, the commonest raptor we have, it wouldn't really matter biologically if a proportion of those buzzards were removed each year in selected areas to benefit other species. That doesn't worry me at all. But the rarer species that are still on the way up and still, you know, in very low numbers, like, for example, white-tailed eagles or whatever it may be, then I myself would like to see those remain on the protected list for the time being. But there comes a point, I think, with every protected species, if it reaches a level at which it's damaging other species, then we need to think again. They don't need, once they're on the protected list, they don't need to stay there indefinitely.
Patrick Galbraith, can you have a crack at that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting the way that, so badgers particularly, the sort of relationship that we have culturally with badgers is very, very different to foxes. I can't really ever imagine a situation where the public could be persuaded that controlling badgers for the good of curlew is the right way to go. I mean, there are people out there who I think would sort of jump up and down at that, who probably wouldn't really know an awful lot about curlew at all. I mean, the badger is something that we really, you know, it has a very key cultural place in Britain. I think possibly because of how poorly badgers were treated in the past, we have a sort of collective guilt around badgers. You know, there were some pretty horrific things that went on, but yeah, but the idea that we're going to be able to control badgers particularly, I think would be very, very difficult. And yeah.
Tim, are badgers an issue where you are?
Not as much as they were, because neighbouring areas have been involved with the TB badger culling. Okay. We've had the numbers have noticeably lessened. You know, most of my work is I've got trail cameras out and we're out and out with the thermal imaging, and yeah, the badger activity is less. And to be honest, I'm not finding many nests predated by badgers at the moment. That is a knock-on from reduced population from the TB cull, I am sure.
But the point about the spread of buzzards across the country, you'd expect their population to go down because of all the rabbit disease, and they've actually increased and spread right across. In 1990, they were halfway across Shropshire, and now they're right across in East Anglia. And it's the availability of pheasants that's fueled the growth of buzzards that people are now complaining about.
Leo,
not to try and do the buzzards in, the solutions to remove their food supply.
Leo, I'm very sorry your chat function's not working. What we'll do is we'll wrap this up now, I think, given that we're an hour and a half in. Thank you very much, everybody. I wondered if I'm just sort of starting to get a sense. I have worked in and around some of these issues for years and years, and I was learning stuff this evening, trying to get a national picture on an issue which I think is quite often presented as being black and white and very easy to understand. You either love it or you hate it. I don't think that we're any closer to either loving or hating predator control after this evening, but I hope what we've maybe done is talk about some of the difficulties in delivering it, how much we want to deliver it, how much we are prepared to do this for curlews. Will we do it for any other bird? There's a huge amount of conversations which come out of this evening. But if what we've done, I hope, is talk through some of the technical, the practical issues around it. I wonder whether or not we just quickly go through the panel and give a sense of the value of predator control and actually how important that'll be for curlews into the future. Tim, can we maybe start with you?
Well, purely anecdotally, from my experience, this is something that I've said repeatedly. We've now had 6 successful breeding seasons for curlew. A lot of that, you know, everything's come together basically. We haven't had big weather events mid period. with targeted predator control, and now seeing that new territories are taken up each year, more birds are nesting. So
Sure.
I don't
No,
want
quite
to
right.
bang my own drum, but I'm sure predator control is a key factor for that.
Russ, can we go to you?
Yeah, I'm going to end on a philosophical point, which is one that Mary and I have been chewing over a lot recently. How many curlews do we want in England? How many curlews do we want in the UK? You're having this discussion with forestry to meet our tree planting targets to mitigate the impacts of the climate change that we ourselves have generated. We are going to lose curlews. Do we accept that the population in the UK might decline to 30,000 pairs, but then stabilise because of various interventions, and we meet our tree planting targets and start to mitigate climate change? That would see half the population disappear under trees. Is that acceptable? If you go back in time, if you go back a few thousand years, it was mostly woodland in lowland England. There wouldn't have been any curlews there. So we're currently maintaining them in an artificial landscape that we've created. So when you start to think about, the question of how many curlews do we actually want, it binds together into this question of how we balance off forestry, how that impacts on predator numbers and the predation issue. And that's something we're wrangling, and we haven't got the answers to that at the minute. Is the default that we are at 58,500 curlews in the UK and we will not budge from defending those to the hilt? Or do we accept that there's going to have to be all these different trade-offs, and some of those have been discussed tonight? And that's a really difficult philosophical one to start thinking through.
Quite right, Russell. That's brilliant. Patrick.
Yeah, sorry. What was your question, Patrick? Your final question?
Just to give a personal sense of the importance of whether or not how you rate predator control as a conservation tool.
Well, I think it's part, it's part of the picture, isn't it? I think what really comes out of this conversation and just looking at the comments is the difficulty of getting people to work together. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge really moving forwards with Curlew, is sort of listening to each other, and also not allowing Curlew to become sort of politicized, and not allowing people to sort of bash each other with Curlew, and sort of understanding that there are a lot of different stakeholders who all have a part to play, and all of whom are very passionate about Curlew, and sort of they might be coming from a slightly different place, but unless we can talk to people who are coming from a different place, then I think Curlew, as well as many other things, are pretty doomed.
Ian, the last word.
Well, I think we have to face the fact that in modern Britain we have an environment, or we've created an environment that at the moment is very favourable to certain generalist predators. Leo Smith mentioned the food supply, pheasants, or other things as well, of course. But while ever we have that situation of a massive food supply for these generalist birds, then they're going to prey on other birds, to the generalist mammals and birds, I should say. They're going to prey on other things to the extent that they could cause massive declines, and in some cases extinction, I think. So the question is really, what do we want to do about this? Do we want to do anything? Are we going to maintain small populations of birds or whatever it is scattered around in the hope that one day other things will change in the country, and these populations can recover from their own volition? I just don't know. I like to not give up on these things, but keep certain populations going for as long as we can, just in case land use and other things change that create a favourable environment for them again. But otherwise, I think we do have to recognise that if this situation continues, we are going to lose a lot of birds, a lot of ground nesting species from much of Britain, possibly from the whole country.
Thanks very much, Ian. I don't think we were going to answer any questions once and for all this evening, but I hope what we've done is raise funding for predator control, the practicalities of predator control, the impact of game bird releases on increasing predator numbers in the first place. There's loads of really important things that we need to look at this evening, but I think as long as we're actually talking about it and not working maybe on supposition or working on ideas that maybe we reckon or have imagined, better conversations, as Patrick Galbraith has said earlier this evening. Let's all keep in touch. Thank you very much, everybody. That's brilliant. And thank you for coming. And thank you, everybody, for coming as well.
Thank you, Patrick. Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick, for sharing.